Hi, this is John Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. In this week's Torah and Psychology post, Parshas Matos-Masei, we're going to focus on the beginning of Parshas Matos, which discusses the laws around nedarim, of making a neder. And it's interesting that the pasuk specifically explains how Moshe Rabbeinu went and told the Roshei HaMatot, the heads of the tribes. And there are different explanations about why the Torah, why Hashem created this, in a sense, structure, that Moshe Rabbeinu needed to tell the head of the tribes first about this law of making vows. Because you could say, essentially, the commandment is relevant, and it's something that applies to every single individual person, about how they use their words, about the commitment to one's words, not to make a false promise. But why, we can ask, should the Roshei HaMatot, the heads of the tribes, be specifically singled out as being the beginning of this process? Now we're going to focus on the explanation of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch takes on a systemic, you could say, communal outlook and perspective on what is the connection between the role of the Roshei HaMatot, the heads of the tribes, and this commandment about nedarim. And Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that the Bnei Yisrael, Am Yisrael, was made up in different, you could say, fragments that had different parts. Yes, we know that Am Yisrael was united. There was Achdus, and in terms of the hashkafa, the perspective is that we view Am Yisrael as being one single body, and we have Moshe Rabbeinu as being the leader of Am Yisrael. But built into that structure, there is an understanding that there are hierarchies, in a sense, or there are different sections of Am Yisrael, and once they are split up, you can view them as different parts and individual elements of a whole, but there are different parts to them, and each of those parts had a head, a Roshei HaMatot. So taking on this structure, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that it's almost in terms of like a society. Am Yisrael obviously also functioned as a society, and society, in a community, there are different sections, different parts, and in order for it to function in a cohesive way, and in order for the values of a system, the cultural values, the society of Am Yisrael to function and to be committed to the right values, you need to make sure that it is, in a sense, passed down through the right channels. And that is the Roshei HaMatot, the heads of the tribes, their responsibility. Although the commandment wasn't for every single individual, they represented leadership. They represented how this funnel, you could say, that it channeled the values of the Torah, the values that Am Yisrael was supposed to live in accordance to these values of the Torah as an individual body in terms of the whole society. But in order for that structure to be established and to function, you need to have the Roshei HaMatot. And this feeds into, you could say, whether it's from a psychological perspective, it's more in terms of my work as a therapist, but also as a clinical social worker. This ties into more and resonates more with the outlook of social work, of a communal, a systemic perspective of how you can identify a need in terms of communal social work and the way that social work works in a therapeutic way from a systemic perspective. Yes, you can identify the need of an individual, and you can work with the individual, but how that can be brought about and what's the most efficient and effective way is when you look at the whole, you look at the system as a whole. And this can certainly go into family systems as well. If you want to there's a community, society, you've got your neighbors, you have your families, and you have the individual. There are different levels of this system. But if you identify who is, you could say, the top of that hierarchy, or the Roshei HaMatot, the ones who have the responsibility and also the ability to be able to inspire, to influence, and to create the right, in a sense, the precedent and impression that can then influence and have an effect on the individual as well. So this has a therapeutic effect, but also ties into the understanding that systems function because there is an understanding of where and how to influence and where the input can come in order that the output and the influence on the rest of the system comes about and comes into effect. So if we look at, also in terms of the families, and we look at and understand that Yaakov Kamenetsky was often said that parents, the role of a parent is not just, you could say, as a machanech, it's not just to educate, it's to lahashpia, it's a mashpia, someone who influences, that it's like a ramp that funnels and channels down from parents to the children, that the values that the parent holds as the head of the tribe of their family, will then influence the children. So if we see here, as Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it's really an appreciation for the way systems function. And through that, it can take the value of Nadarim, the value of cherishing and valuing the words that come out of your mouth. And that can then influence and can channel down and influence the rest of the system and every single individual person in Am Yisrael. Have a good Shabbos and keep well.